The land that would produce the Crusades did not look like a place preparing for anything. It looked, and looking is the wrong word, since there was no one yet to look, like water finding the shortest way down a broken roof. Northern and Western Europe in the centuries before any king or pope entered this story was a patchwork of river basins pressed close together by hills that never rose high enough to be called mountains and never lay low enough to be called plains. The Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, the Meuse, these rivers did not run in isolation the way the Nile or the Euphrates ran, alone across a wide desert, gathering an entire civilization along a single line of water. They ran instead in a crowded lattice, each basin a few dozen kilometers from the next, separated by ridges of limestone and clay that broke the land into 1,000 small watersheds rather than one great one. A river valley in Mesopotamia could feed an empire. A river valley in Picardy or Champagne could feed a village, and then it met a hill, and then it met another river valley entirely. The climate compounded what the terrain had already decided. This was not a land of 2 seasons, one wet and one bone dry, the way the river civilizations of the ancient world had been built around a predictable annual flood. Western Europe received rain nearly year-round, an oceanic pattern driven by weather systems that rolled in off the Atlantic, with almost no season entirely free of moisture. Annual rainfall across much of what is now northern France, Flanders, and the Rhineland ran between 600 and 900 millimeters, spread with irritating evenness across 10 or 11 months rather than concentrated in one dramatic flood season that a farmer could plan an entire year around. There was no Nile to predict. There was only a sky that rained a little, constantly, and soil that consequently never dried out enough to crack, never flooded dramatically enough to deposit the thick black silt that renewed a floodplain's fertility year after year without any human effort at all. The rivers of the Fertile Crescent did the farmer's work of soil renewal for him. The rivers of northern Europe did not. The soil itself was a further complication, and a stubborn one. Much of the plain that stretched from the Paris Basin through Flanders and into the lower Rhineland sat atop heavy clay, laid down by retreating glaciers 10,000 years earlier, dense and waterlogged, and almost impossible to work with the simple scratch plows that had served Mediterranean farmers on their lighter, drier soils for millennia. Clay of this density holds water the way a fist holds sand, seeming to grip everything and release nothing, and a farmer attempting to turn it with a plow designed for the crumbling loam of Italy or Iberia would find his blade dragging, his oxen straining, his furrow shallow and uneven. Only a heavier plow, one with a moldboard capable of turning this dense earth completely rather than merely scratching its surface, could make such land productive at all, and such plows required more draft power than a single ox could provide, which meant more animals, which meant more fodder, which meant land given over to feeding beasts rather than feeding people. The soil that would eventually make northern Europe wealthy first made it slow and difficult and stingy with the food it returned for the labor invested in it. Forest covered what the clay and the rivers had not already claimed, and this too was a fact with consequences rather than mere scenery. Estimates drawn from pollen records and charcoal deposits suggest that as late as the centuries following the collapse of Roman authority in the West, something on the order of 70% of the land between the Loire and the Rhine remained under closed canopy woodland, oak and beech and hornbeam standing in stands thick enough to block sunlight from the forest floor for most of the growing season. Clearing this forest was not a task completed in a single generation or even several. A single hectare of mature oak woodland, felled with iron axes and the labor of several men, might take the better part of a season to clear fully, root systems included, before the ground beneath it could be plowed at all. The forest was not backdrop. It was an obstacle measured in labor years, standing between any given family and any given field they might wish to plant. What this terrain and this climate together produced, before any human society had organized itself in response, was a landscape that offered no single overwhelming advantage and no single overwhelming reprieve. It was not desert, where survival depended on finding the rare river and clustering along it. It was not the wide alluvial plain of the Yellow River or the Ganges, where a great floodplain, once mastered, could feed enormous and concentrated populations from a single unified effort at water control. It was a terrain of modest, scattered, hard-won plots, a river bend here, a cleared hillside there, a patch of drained lowland somewhere else, none of them large enough to support the kind of centralized irrigation bureaucracy that had organized the river civilizations of the ancient Near East, and none of them poor enough to force total abandonment either. It was land that rewarded small-scale, intensive, close management and punished any assumption of abundance. A family could clear a plot of perhaps 4 or 5 hectares across a working lifetime, farm it with the heavy plow the clay demanded, and produce enough to survive, barely, and only if nothing else claimed a share of that harvest. That arithmetic found its answer sometime in the 10th century, and the answer was not generous. Faced with a fixed number of hectares and a rising number of heirs, the landholding families of northern and western Europe settled, gradually and without any single decree announcing it, on a solution that solved the problem for the land while creating an entirely new one for the people living on it. The whole of an estate would pass to a single heir, almost always the eldest son, intact and undivided. Split a 5-hectare holding among 4 sons, and within 2 generations each fragment would be too small to support a family working it with the heavy plow the clay demanded. Keep it whole and pass it to 1 son only, and the land continues to feed a household indefinitely. Custom historians would later call primogeniture was not, at bottom, a preference. It was a response to a ceiling the terrain itself had set, adopted at different speeds and in different forms across the region. The Norman lands moved towards strict primogeniture faster and more completely than parts of the Rhineland and southern France, where partible inheritance persisted far longer among free peasant holdings even as the great noble estates consolidated. The same clay, the same rainfall, the same crowded river basins produced different answers, depending on how tightly a given lordship policed its own succession, which is worth noting before assuming any of this was automatic. For the eldest son, this arrangement was fortune. For every son born after him, it was something closer to exile conducted at home. A younger son of a knightly or minor noble household in 11th century Normandy, Anjou, or Champagne inherited nothing of the land itself, and typically very little coin besides. What he did inherit, because his family could afford little else to give him, was training. From roughly the age of 7, he was raised in the expectation of mounted combat, horsemanship, the couched lance, the maintenance of increasingly expensive iron armor and weaponry, an education that assumed a future built around fighting, since fighting, unlike farming, required no fixed plot of ground to practice. The armor alone represented a serious outlay. A mail hauberk of the period, several thousand interlocking iron rings riveted by hand, could take a smith the better part of 2 or 3 months of dedicated labor to produce, and a warhorse bred and trained for shock combat rather than plow work cost multiples of an ordinary farm animal's price. Families staked this expense on younger sons precisely because there was nothing else left to stake on them. Land had already gone to the eldest. What remained was the sword. The result, repeated across tens of thousands of noble and knightly households over several generations, was a growing class of young men fully trained for war, fully equipped for war, entirely without inheritance, and with no legitimate outlet for either their training or their ambition. Chronicles and charters of the period are dense with references to these men, described variously as juvens, the young, a term that in the Latin of the 11th century did not necessarily mean youthful in age so much as landless, unmarried, and unsettled, sometimes well into their 30s. They attached themselves to the households of greater lords, fought in local feuds, not because those feuds served any cause beyond themselves, but because fighting was the only occupation for which they had been prepared, and drifted, restless and often violent, through a countryside that had no further use for their particular skill once the harvest was in and the local disputes had been settled by force or by exhaustion. Regional church councils of the period, meeting to address what they described plainly as an excess of armed disorder among the young nobility, attempted repeatedly to limit private warfare through measures collectively known as the peace of God and the truce of God, restricting combat to certain days of the week and certain seasons of the year. That such measures had to be legislated at all and reissued at council after council because the first attempt had failed to hold is itself a record of how large this problem had grown and how little the existing structures of Western Christendom could do to absorb it through ordinary means. It would be a mistake to treat this outcome as automatic, the single inevitable product of land scarcity meeting a rising population, because the same pressure did not produce the same class everywhere it appeared. In parts of Scandinavia facing comparable limits on arable land, similar demographic pressure among younger sons found a different outlet entirely, one built around seaborne raiding and, eventually, settlement in Iceland, Greenland, and stretches of the British and Frankish coastlines, a maritime solution rather than a landed military one, shaped by a coastline that offered ships instead of horses as the available technology. In parts of northern Italy, where urban commerce had developed further and faster than in Normandy or Champagne, surplus sons of merchant and lesser noble families were more often absorbed into trade, into the notarial profession, into the church's expanding bureaucratic apparatus, rather than into a purely military existence. The mounted, landless, church-restrained knight was a specifically Frankish and Norman answer to the land problem, produced by a particular combination of heavy cavalry tradition inherited from Carolingian military practice, an ecclesiastical structure powerful enough to attempt, if not fully succeed at, restraining private violence, and a landholding system that had committed early and thoroughly to primogeniture. Other regions, facing comparably hard ground, built other things. By the closing decades of the 11th century, this surplus had become, in the eyes of the men who governed the church, less a local nuisance than a standing hazard to the stability of Christendom itself. The chroniclers of the period, writing in the years immediately following, would describe a Latin Christendom in the last decades of the 11th century as a land dense with feuding, private castellans waging war against each other and against church property alike, and armed young men without office, without land, and without any prospect of acquiring either through peaceful means. Bishops complained in their correspondence of knights who plundered monastic estates for want of any other source of income. Regional lords found their own authority tested constantly by retainers whose loyalty extended only as far as the next opportunity for plunder. The Peace of God councils, for all their reissuing, addressed only the symptom, restricting when violence could occur rather than removing the underlying population of men for whom violence was the only trained occupation available to them. Into this standing army with nowhere sanctioned to march came a request from far outside the borders of Western Christendom entirely, and it arrived at almost exactly the moment such a request could find an audience prepared to hear it. In the spring of 1095, envoys from the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I reached the papal court seeking a very specific and very limited kind of help: mercenary reinforcements, professional soldiers drawn from the same tradition of heavy Western cavalry that had already served Byzantine emperors on and off for a century, to help stem the advance of Seljuk Turkish forces that had pressed deep into Byzantine Anatolia in the years following the empire's catastrophic defeat at Manzikert 2 decades earlier. Alexios wanted several hundred knights, perhaps a few thousand at most, fighting under Byzantine command and Byzantine pay, exactly the kind of narrow, professional, contained arrangement that had brought Western mercenaries east before. What he received instead, within a matter of months, was something he had neither requested nor could have anticipated, and something considerably harder to command. Pope Urban II received the Byzantine appeal at a council in Piacenza that same year, and by autumn had traveled north across the Alps into France, his own homeland, to convene a much larger council at Clermont in November. What Urban said at Clermont on the 27th day of that month survives in no single reliable transcript. The 4 principal chroniclers who recorded versions of the speech, Robert of Reims, Fulcher of Chartres, Baldric of Dole, and Guibert of Nogent, each wrote years after the event, each shaped by what had happened in the intervening years, and each account differs from the others in emphasis and detail. What can be established with reasonable confidence, because it is consistent across every version and because it matches what followed, is the shape of the offer rather than its exact wording. An appeal to help fellow Christians suffering under Turkish advance in the East, paired with a call to recover Jerusalem and the holy places from Muslim control, paired further with a specific and, for the audience gathered at Clermont, entirely novel promise that those who undertook this armed journey out of devotion, rather than for the sake of gaining glory or riches, would receive remission of the penance owed for their sins. That final promise was the mechanism, and it is worth being precise about what kind of mechanism it was. Western Christendom already possessed an extensive tradition of pilgrimage as a form of penance, journeys to Rome, to Santiago de Compostela, to Jerusalem itself, undertaken by individuals seeking to atone for specific sins through hardship and devotion. What Urban offered at Claremont fused this existing penitential tradition to something the pilgrimage tradition alone had never included: armed conquest, undertaken by the very class of trained, landless, restless fighting men the peace of God councils had spent a generation failing to contain. A pilgrimage earned penance through suffering. This offer earned the same spiritual credit through combat, provided that combat served the recovery of Christian holy places rather than private feud or plunder. For a knight with no land, no legitimate outlet for his training, and by the standards of his own era's religious teaching, a soul burdened by years of exactly the kind of local violence the Church had been condemning, this was not a marginal inducement. It was a complete solution to two problems his own society had not otherwise resolved: what to do with his sword, and what to do about the state of his soul. The response at Claremont itself, and in the months that followed as preaching of the Crusades spread through France, the Rhineland, and beyond, by figures including Urban himself, on an extended preaching tour and popular itinerant preachers, such as Peter the Hermit, exceeded what any single council or campaign of preaching had produced before. Estimates of the total number who took the cross in the following year vary considerably among historians, running from perhaps 60,000 at the low end to well over 100,000, including non-combatants, a range wide enough that no precise figure should be treated as settled, but even the most conservative estimates describe a mobilization on a scale unmatched by any prior papal summons. Crucially, and this is where the shape of the earlier chapters becomes visible again without needing to be restated, those who answered were disproportionately drawn from exactly the population the previous decades had produced in surplus: younger sons of knightly families, with no land to lose by leaving, minor nobility whose prospects at home had been fixed by inheritance customs before they could speak, and men whose training in mounted combat had until this point found no legitimate purpose Christendom's own institutions could supply. Not everyone who took the cross fit this description, and it would be a distortion to suggest otherwise. Some among the greater lords who joined, men such as Raymond IV of Toulouse and Godfrey of Bouillon, held substantial territories already and risked considerable wealth and standing rather than seeking land they otherwise lacked. Their motives, so far as the surviving record allows any confidence at all, appear to have combined genuine religious conviction, a competitive desire for standing among their peers, and calculation about opportunity in roughly unknowable proportions, and no single explanation should be assumed to have outweighed the others in every individual case. What can be said with more confidence is about the base of the movement rather than its leadership, the great mass of knights, the men whose names rarely survive individually in the chronicles, but whose collective weight determined whether an army of this size could be assembled at all, came overwhelmingly from precisely the landless military class the previous two generations of inheritance practice had produced, and the peace of God councils had failed to occupy. The first of these armies did not wait for careful preparation. Peter the Hermit's followers, tens of thousands strong by most contemporary estimates, left for Constantinople in the spring of 1096, months ahead of the great princely armies still assembling their supplies and their finances back in France and the Rhineland. They crossed Hungary and the Balkans on foot, largely without the logistical support that would later accompany the better organized princely contingents. Provisioning an army of this size across unfamiliar territory required either purchase, foraging, or plunder, and this early crusade relied on all three in shifting and often violent combination. By the time this force reached Byzantine territory, Emperor Alexios found himself managing an armed multitude several times larger than the professional mercenary contingent he had originally requested, and considerably less disciplined. He ferried them across the Bosphorus into Anatolia quickly, eager to move the problem off his own soil. What awaited them on the Anatolian side was a landscape that bore no resemblance to anything in their prior experience. The Anatolian plateau sits at considerable elevation, much of it above 800 meters, and its interior receives annual rainfall in many districts of under 400 millimeters, roughly half of what the river basins of northern France provided. Summer temperatures in the interior routinely exceed 38 degrees Celsius, with almost no shade across long stretches of open steppe. None of the assumptions that had governed supply and movement in the crowded, well-watered river basins of home applied here. There was no dense lattice of nearby valleys to forage between. Distances between reliable water sources could run to a full day's march or more, and a force accustomed to crossing a river every few kilometers found itself instead crossing dry ground for the better part of a week between wells. The result, at Civitot in October of 1096, was catastrophe. Seljuk forces under Kilij Arslan the first encountered this poorly organized, poorly supplied crusading contingent and destroyed the greater part of it in a single engagement. Chroniclers describe the ground afterward littered with the bones of the fallen, left unburied for years as a landmark to later crusading armies passing the same route. Peter the Hermit himself survived only because he had returned briefly to Constantinople before the battle to negotiate additional supplies. The princely armies that followed through the winter of 1096 and into 1097 were, by comparison, formidable instruments, led by men such as Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, and Raymond of Toulouse, each commanding several thousand knights and considerably larger numbers of infantry and non-combatants, moving in separate contingents along different routes through the Balkans before converging on Constantinople. Their combined numbers, by the time they had assembled before the city walls in the spring of 1097, likely exceeded the 50,000 mark by a considerable margin once non-combatants are included, though, as with the numbers at Clermont, precise figures should be treated with caution. Alexios received this second, much larger wave with visible unease. An army capable of threatening Turkish holdings in Anatolia was also, self-evidently, an army capable of threatening Constantinople itself, and the emperor extracted oaths of homage and promises to restore any recaptured Byzantine territory to imperial control before ferrying the Crusaders across the straits, a condition Bohemond in particular would later treat as considerably more flexible than the emperor had intended. Once across, the combined Crusader host encountered the same Anatolian terrain that had destroyed Peter's followers the previous autumn, but with resources and discipline the earlier expedition had lacked. At Dorylaeum in July of 1097, Kilij Arslan attempted the same tactic that had succeeded at Civitot, striking a portion of the Crusader column while it was separated from the rest. This time the coordination between the divided contingents held long enough for the remainder of the army to arrive in support, and the Turkish force was driven off after a battle that lasted the greater part of a day in punishing heat. The victory came at a cost the chronicles record with particular attention to a single resource: water. Accounts of the march in the weeks following Dorylaeum describe soldiers and horses dying of thirst in numbers that rivaled the losses of open battle, as the army crossed stretches of the plateau where the wells marked on no map they possessed proved dry, poisoned, or simply too small to supply a force of this size. Horses in particular died at a rate that alarmed every commander in the host, since a knight without his mount was, for the purposes of the heavy cavalry tactics this army depended on, no longer a knight in any functional sense at all. The city that awaited the Crusaders in late October of 1097 was unlike any fortification most of them had encountered in the west. Antioch's walls, built and repeatedly reinforced since late Roman times, ran for several kilometers along a course that climbed the steep slopes of Mount Silpius before descending again to the Orontes River, enclosing not just the city itself, but a stretch of mountainside too rugged for any besieging army to fully surround. Contemporary accounts describe more than 400 towers set along this circuit, though the true number is disputed. What is not disputed is that no siege engine or scaling technique the Crusaders had brought from France could threaten a wall of this scale, and that the mountainous terrain on the city's southern flank made a complete encirclement, the basic precondition of starving a garrison into submission, effectively impossible with the forces available. The Crusader leadership settled, by necessity rather than preference, on a partial blockade, fortifying camps along the routes into the city they could control while leaving the mountain approaches and at least one gate only loosely watched. This compromise would define the entire 8 months of the siege that followed, and it cut both ways. Supplies could still reach the defenders in trickles through the unblockaded routes, prolonging a siege the Crusaders had no ability to force to a quicker conclusion. But the same porous perimeter that let some supplies through the city walls could not stop the steady collapse of supply for the besiegers themselves. camped in a countryside stripped bare by their own foraging within the first 2 months. Winter made this worse, in ways the chroniclers describe with unusual specificity. Rain across the Antioch region in the winter of 1097 into 1098 turned the Crusader camps into standing mud, rotted tents and equipment, and coincided with a collapse in foraging yields as the surrounding countryside, already picked over, produced almost nothing through the coldest months. Fulcher of Chartres records prices for basic foodstuffs rising to levels that made ordinary provisioning impossible for all but the wealthiest lords in the host, with many among the common soldiery reduced to eating pack animals, hides, and, according to several accounts, worse. Desertion followed, at every level of the army. Peter the Hermit himself, having survived Civitate, attempted to abandon the siege entirely during this winter, and was brought back only after Tancred pursued and retrieved him. Even Bohemond, one of the more capable and ambitious commanders in the host, is recorded departing periodically to forage in the surrounding region, rather than remain fixed before walls his forces could not breach. What broke the stalemate was neither engineering nor assault, but a negotiation conducted in secret between Bohemond and a disaffected officer within the Antioch garrison, an Armenian commander named Firuz, responsible for a tower along the city's less heavily watched southern wall. The exact terms and motives recorded in the chronicles vary, some suggesting resentment at treatment by the Turkish governor, others financial incentive offered by Bohemond, and the truth likely combined both in proportions no surviving source can settle with confidence. On the night of the 2nd and 3rd of June, 1098, a small party of Crusader knights scaled the wall at the tower under Firuz's command, using ladders passed up in darkness, opened a nearby gate from within, and let the main Crusader force into the city before the bulk of the garrison could organize a defense. The city fell within hours, in scenes of slaughter the chroniclers do not minimize, directed against a population that included Christians as well as Muslims, caught indiscriminately in the chaos of a city taken by storm rather than by negotiated surrender. The irony of the siege's conclusion arrived within days. A relieving Turkish army under Kerboga of Mosul, marching to break the siege the Crusaders had been unable to press to a conclusion on their own, arrived only after the city had already fallen, and proceeded to besiege the Crusaders in turn, now trapped inside walls they had just taken, with supplies inside the city nearly as exhausted as their own had been outside it for the preceding winter. This second inverted siege lasted barely 3 weeks before it broke, resolved by a combination the chroniclers frame as morally decisive and materially convenient in equal measure: the reported discovery of a relic identified as the Holy Lance beneath the floor of Antioch's cathedral, which restored the starving Crusader army's willingness to fight, and a sortie on the 28th of June that caught Kerboga's coalition divided by its own internal rivalries and unable to respond with unified force. The army that finally marched south from Antioch in early 1099 was, by every measure, a diminished force. Disputes among the surviving commanders over who would hold Antioch itself, Bohemond ultimately claiming the city for himself, rather than restoring it to Byzantine control as sworn at Constantinople, delayed the march for the better part of a year and stripped away several thousand men who remained behind to garrison and administer the newly divided territories. What remained, perhaps 12,000 fighting men by the more conservative estimates, moved down the Levantine coast through the summer heat, bypassing the heavily fortified coastal cities they lacked the numbers or the engines to besiege, and instead negotiating passage or accepting tribute from local rulers eager to see this army continue on toward Jerusalem rather than turn against them. They reached the city walls in early June and found a garrison and a set of defenses considerably less daunting in scale than Antioch's mountain-backed circuit had been, but a far more severe problem standing behind those walls: water. Jerusalem's Fatimid governor had, in anticipation of the siege, ordered wells and cisterns in the immediate vicinity poisoned or filled in, and the surrounding countryside in early summer offered almost nothing in the way of natural springs within a reasonable march of the Crusader camps. The nearest reliable source lay at some distance, requiring water to be carried back to the siege lines under a punishing sun, in conditions that sickened men and killed pack animals at a rate the chroniclers describe with the same specificity they had applied to the Antioch winter. Timber for siege engines was scarcer still. The surrounding hills largely denuded of usable wood, forcing the Crusaders to strip materials from a Genoese fleet that had fortuitously arrived at Jaffa and to send foraging parties considerable distances into wooded country near Samaria to gather enough beams for even 2 functional siege towers. The assault came on the 15th of July, 1099, after little more than 5 weeks of siege, a duration far shorter than Antioch's 8 months, made possible less by any tactical advantage than by sheer exhaustion of both sides and a religious fervor among the besiegers, whipped by a barefoot procession around the city walls days earlier, that pushed the final assault forward before supplies could fail entirely. The city fell within a day, and the massacre that followed, directed against Jerusalem's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants alike, is recorded by the Crusaders' own chroniclers in terms that leave little room for later minimization. Whatever the precise casualty figures, disputed among historians to this day, ultimately were. What followed the conquest was a problem this army had not yet faced in quite this form. Not how to take a city, but how an army of perhaps 12,000 men, most of whom had taken the cross for a single-armed pilgrimage rather than permanent settlement, might hold a hostile and unfamiliar region indefinitely once the immediate objective had been achieved. Within days of the city's fall, Godfrey of Bouillon was elected to lead the new Christian territory, taking the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre rather than king, a modesty of title that did not survive his death within the year, when his brother Baldwin accepted coronation as Baldwin I, King of Jerusalem. The territory Baldwin inherited was, in the most basic material sense, absurdly overextended relative to the population available to defend it. The great majority of Crusaders who had marched to Jerusalem regarded their vow as fulfilled once the city was taken and departed for home within weeks or months, some historians estimating that fewer than 300 knights remained in the entire kingdom of Jerusalem by the following year, tasked with holding a strip of conquered territory running along the coast and inland hill country for several hundred kilometers. This was not one kingdom, but, within a few years, 4 distinct polities: the kingdom of Jerusalem itself, the county of Edessa established earlier under Baldwin before his coronation, the principality of Antioch under Bohemond and his successors, and the county of Tripoli, established somewhat later under Raymond of Toulouse's heirs after a prolonged siege of that coastal city. Each held territory far exceeding what its available garrison could plausibly defend against the surrounding Turkish, Fatimid, and other regional powers, none of which had abandoned their own claims to this land simply because a crusading army had passed through it. The fragility of this arrangement showed itself almost immediately. Baldwin I spent much of his reign campaigning nearly constantly, simply to hold territory already claimed, rather than expanding it further, and the county of Edessa, the furthest flung and most exposed of the 4 states, would prove within a few decades to be the first to fall. A vulnerability rooted less in any single battlefield failure than in the basic arithmetic of too much land and too few men, the same arithmetic that had shaped the class of knights who had marched here in the first place, now inverted and turned against the conquerors themselves. The answer this generation of rulers arrived at was architectural, and it emerged gradually, refined through decades of trial against the specific military problem the Crusader states faced: a garrison too small to meet field armies in open battle, spread across a territory too large to concentrate that garrison in any single place, and surrounded by populations and powers under no obligation to remain passive. A single fortress, however strong, could not solve this by itself. What developed instead across the 12th century was a network. Castles positioned at intervals along roads, river crossings, and mountain passes, each one capable of holding a garrison numbering in the dozens rather than the thousands, and each one designed so that this small garrison could withstand a siege far longer than its numbers alone would suggest. The design principle that made this possible is now known as the concentric castle, and it solved the small garrison problem through geometry rather than manpower. Rather than a single wall, a concentric fortress presented an attacker with 2 or more complete defensive circuits: an outer wall lower and thinner, an inner wall higher and thicker, arranged so that defenders on the inner wall could fire over the heads of defenders on the outer one, and so that even if an attacker breached the first circuit entirely, a second, fully independent line of defense remained intact behind it. Craque de chevaliers, granted to the Knights Hospitaller in 1142 and rebuilt and expanded by that order across the following decades, stands as the clearest surviving example of what this principle achieved in practice. Positioned at an elevation of roughly 750 meters on a spur controlling the Homs Gap, one of the few practical routes between the Syrian coast and the interior, the fortress commanded a choke point through which any army moving between those two regions would need to pass. Its outer wall, reinforced with rounded towers designed specifically to deflect the force of siege engines rather than absorb it directly on a flat face, enclosed an inner fortification set higher still, connected by a narrow, defensible passage that meant an attacking force which somehow broke through the outer circuit still faced, in effect, a second complete siege before reaching the inner keep. Cisterns cut into the rock beneath the fortress held enough water, by some estimates, to sustain a garrison numbering in the low thousands for a year or more without any resupply from outside, directly answering the water crisis that had nearly broken the crusading army outside Jerusalem 4 decades earlier. This was not merely a bigger wall. It was a specific engineering response to a specific and recurring failure this army had already suffered twice, at Antioch and at Jerusalem both: the vulnerability of a besieging or besieged force to the simple absence of water, and the impossibility, given the terrain, of maintaining a complete encirclement with limited manpower. A concentric fortress with its own water supply did not need relief from outside to survive a siege of any ordinary duration, and did not need a large garrison to make that survival possible, since geometry rather than numbers now did much of the defensive work. The institution that came to hold and garrison many of these fortresses solved a parallel problem, one of continuity rather than construction. An ordinary feudal garrison depended on a lord's household, his family's fortunes, his heirs' willingness or ability to continue funding a distant outpost, all of which could fail through no fault of the fortress itself: a death, a disputed succession, a family's attention drawn back to lands in Europe rather than a castle in Syria. The military orders, the Knights Templar founded around 1119, and the Knights Hospitaller reorganized along military lines in the decades following, offered something different: an institution with no heirs to dispute, funded by donations and property holdings across Western Christendom that flowed into a common treasury rather than a single family's purse, and staffed by men who had taken vows binding them to the order itself rather than to any single lord's household. A castle held by the Templars or Hospitallers did not become vacant or contested when any individual knight died. The order simply assigned another. This mattered enormously for exactly the kind of exposed, garrison-thin fortress the Levant required. By the middle of the 12th century, the military orders had come to hold a disproportionate share of the most strategically exposed castles in the Crusader states, including Crac de Chevaliers itself, precisely because ordinary baronial families increasingly lacked the sustained resources or institutional permanence to hold such positions across generations, while the orders, drawing on income and recruits from estates scattered across France, England, Iberia, and beyond, could. The system that emerged by the latter half of the 12th century was therefore not simply more castles, but a specific combination: a defensive geometry that let a small number of defenders outlast a much larger besieging force, paired with an institutional structure capable of maintaining that defense across decades without depending on any single family's fortunes. Neither element alone would have solved the problem. A concentric castle held by an ordinary baronial garrison still faced the succession crises that had already thinned Crusader ranks once King Baldwin's own line proved fragile. An institution without the fortress design still faced the basic arithmetic of holding indefensible ground with too few men. The fortress system was still decades from its mature form when the first of the 4 Crusader states collapsed, and its fall confirmed exactly the vulnerability that system had been built to answer. Edessa, the furthest inland and most thinly garrisoned of the Crusader territories, fell to the forces of Zengi, the Turkish Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, on the 24th of December, 1144, after a siege of less than a month. The county had never possessed the kind of defensive depth Crac des Chevaliers would later represent. Its capital sat exposed on the eastern edge of Crusader territory, further from the coast and from any hope of naval resupply than any of the other 3 states, held by a garrison whose numbers had never matched the length of frontier it was meant to defend. News of the fall reached Western Europe within months, and Pope Eugenius III issued a formal call for a new crusade in December of 1145, addressed initially to King Louis VII of France, who had in fact already been considering an armed pilgrimage east, for reasons of his own. Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman of his generation, took up the preaching of this second expedition with an energy that drew, within a year, not only Louis and a substantial French following, but also Conrad III, King of Germany, bringing an imperial German army into a crusade for the first time. The two armies that set out in the spring and summer of 1147 were, on paper, formidable, considerably larger and better resourced than the ragged force that had crossed Anatolia half a century earlier. They were also, from the outset, marching largely blind to lessons the first Crusaders had learned at brutal cost. Conrad's German army, taking a route across Anatolia broadly similar to the one that had nearly destroyed Peter the Hermit's followers, suffered a catastrophic defeat near Dorylaeum in October of 1147, ambushed by Seljuk forces while strung out and short of water, in an outcome that echoed the very disaster this same stretch of terrain had produced before. Louis's French army, following a more southerly route along the coast, fared only somewhat better, losing a substantial portion of its baggage and supplies in a mountain ambush near Mount Cadmus in Anatolia, before finally reaching the Levantine coast in a considerably reduced state. Both armies arrived at Antioch and then Jerusalem well short of the numbers and the supplies with which they had departed, and it was this diminished, ill-coordinated force that assembled at the Council of Acre in June of 1148 to decide on a target. The decision that followed remains, among historians of the Crusades, one of the more puzzling of the entire period. Rather than moving against Aleppo or Edessa itself, the territories whose loss had prompted the expedition, the assembled leadership chose to besiege Damascus, a city that had, until this point, generally maintained a working, if uneasy, relationship with the Kingdom of Jerusalem, occasionally cooperating against the shared threat posed by Zengi and his successors. The siege that began in late July of 1148 collapsed within 4 days, and the reasons recorded by chroniclers on both sides point squarely back to terrain and water rather than to any single tactical blunder in battle. The Crusader army initially approached from the west, where orchards and irrigated gardens outside the city offered shade, food, and abundant water drawn from the Barada River's channels, an approach that gave the defenders cover among the trees and walls of the garden district to harass the besiegers constantly. Faced with this, the Crusader leadership made the decision to shift their camp to the eastern side of the city, open ground with a clearer approach to the walls, but ground that offered almost none of the water or shade the western orchards had provided. Within days, the army found itself in a familiar and by now well-documented crisis, men and horses suffering in the heat, with no reliable water source nearby, while news arrived that a relieving force under Zengi's successor, Nur al-Din, was approaching from the north. The siege was abandoned within the week, the assembled Crusader leadership retreating in disarray and mutual recrimination, each contingent blaming the others for the decision to shift camp and for the failure more broadly. Louis and Conrad both returned to Europe by the following year, the expedition achieving none of its stated aims and leaving the Crusader states no more secure, and in several respects considerably less so than before it had begun. By the mid-1180s, the balance of power in the Levant had shifted decisively against the Crusader states, consolidated for the first time under a single ruler capable of uniting Egypt and Syria, Saladin, who had absorbed Nur al-Din's territories, and Fatimid Egypt alike, into one coalition with resources the fragmented Crusader states could never match man for man. The kingdom Saladin now faced was also, in the summer of 1187, unusually divided against itself, its throne contested between rival factions around the ailing King Baldwin IV's succession, a political fragmentation layered on top of the older manpower fragility this story has already traced from its founding decades. Saladin invaded in force that June, and rather than attacking a single fortress in isolation, moved against Tiberias, on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, drawing the assembled Crusader army away from its own secure water sources and into open, arid country to relieve the town. The Crusader leadership, gathered at Sapharia, a position with reliable springs nearby, faced a choice that echoed Damascus almost exactly: remain in a defensible position with adequate water, or march to relieve Tiberias across a stretch of dry, waterless plateau in high summer. Raymond of Tripoli, who held Tiberias and whose own wife was besieged within it, nonetheless argued strenuously against the march, understanding the terrain better than most in the camp. He was overruled. King Guy of Lusignan, pressed by rivals within his own court who accused caution of cowardice, ordered the army forward on the 3rd of July toward Tiberias, across ground that offered no reliable water for the better part of a full day's march in conditions that, by contemporary account, exceeded anything the army had prepared its supply train to endure. Saladin's forces, familiar with this terrain in a way no Crusader force had ever quite managed to be, despite 90 years of costly instruction on exactly this point, harassed the marching column constantly, denying it access to what few wells lay along the route, and setting fire to dry brush upwind to add smoke and heat to a force already suffering badly from thirst. By the following day, the Crusader army had reached only a pair of low hills, known as the Horns of Hattin, still short of the lake whose water might have saved it, encircled and unable to break through to the shoreline it could see but could not reach. What followed on the 4th of July was less a battle in any contested sense than a collapse, an army so weakened by thirst that its infantry disintegrated first, followed by the cavalry, with King Guy himself captured, along with the relic of the True Cross that had accompanied the army into the field. The scale of the defeat was total in a way none of the earlier reverses at Antioch, Jerusalem, or Damascus had been. With the field army destroyed or captured, the fortress network built up so carefully across the previous half-century now stood garrisoned by skeleton forces with no field army left to relieve them, and city after city, including Jerusalem itself in October of that year, surrendered within weeks for want of any force capable of contesting Saladin's advance. Word of Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem reached Western Europe within months, and the response, the Third Crusade, assembled under 3 of the most powerful rulers in Christendom at once: Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England, known to history as Richard the Lionheart. Barbarossa's contribution ended before it truly began, the aging emperor drowning while crossing a river in Cilicia in June of 1190, and much of his army dispersing or continuing on in greatly diminished form. Philip and Richard, arriving by sea rather than by the overland route that had proven so costly to every prior expedition, avoided the Anatolian crossing that had broken armies since the very first crusade, landing directly at the besieged port of Acre instead. Acre fell to the combined Crusader forces in July of 1191 after a prolonged siege, and Philip departed for France shortly after, leaving Richard as the effective sole commander of the remaining crusading army, a force considerably smaller than the coalition that had first assembled in Europe, but one commanded, in Richard, by a general who had studied the terrain's lessons rather than repeated its failures. Richard's subsequent march south along the coast from Acre toward Jaffa, undertaken in the late summer of 1191, was deliberately and unusually disciplined in exactly the respect that had broken prior armies. He kept his forces within sight of the coastline and, wherever possible, within reach of the supply fleet, shadowing his march by sea, refusing to be drawn inland onto ground where water could not be guaranteed. At Arsuf on the 7th of September, Saladin's forces attempted repeatedly to provoke the marching column into breaking formation, the same tactic that had unraveled the army at Hattin, and Richard's forces held their discipline until a controlled countercharge, launched at a moment of Richard's own choosing rather than in response to provocation, drove Saladin's army from the field. Richard would advance within sight of Jerusalem's walls twice in the following year, and retreat both times, concluding, on terrain and logistical grounds his own commanders largely supported, that the city could be taken, but not then supplied or held against the force Saladin could still bring against it inland, a full day's march or more from the coast that had kept every one of Richard's own campaigns alive. The century that followed Richard's treaty confirmed again and again the arrangement he had settled on almost by default. A coastal strip, tethered to Italian shipping, could survive indefinitely on terms no inland conquest ever had. What finally unmade it was not a battle lost on Levantine soil at all, but a crusade that never reached the Levant in the first place. The Fourth Crusade, assembled in 1202 under Venetian sponsorship and heavily dependent on Venice's fleet for transport, found itself unable to pay the sum owed to its own shipbuilders and was diverted, first to the Christian city of Zara on the Adriatic coast, and then, at the urging of a deposed Byzantine claimant offering payment for restoration, to Constantinople itself. The city that had first summoned Western knights to its defense more than a century earlier was sacked by a crusading army in April of 1204, its wealth divided among the Venetians and the crusading barons, and a Latin empire installed on Byzantine soil in place of the empire whose appeal at Piacenza had begun this entire story. The consequence for the Crusader states themselves was indirect but severe. The Byzantine counterweight that had, however unreliably, absorbed Turkish pressure along Anatolia's frontier for a century was gone, replaced by a fractured Latin empire too weak to perform the same function, and the eastern Mediterranean's balance of power tilted further against the coastal strip Richard had fought to preserve. The 13th century that followed was less a story of dramatic reversal than of slow attrition, punctuated by expeditions that achieved partial or temporary gains without altering the underlying arithmetic. The Fifth Crusade, landing in Egypt itself in 1217 on the theory that the Nile Delta was the true key to the Levant, took the port of Damietta in 1219, only to lose the entire army 2 years later when an attempted advance up the Nile toward Cairo was trapped by rising floodwaters the Egyptian defenders deliberately released, drowning the same lesson about water and terrain into a new geography entirely. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, achieved by negotiation in 1229 what a century of combined military expeditions had not: the temporary restoration of Jerusalem to Christian control without a single battle, a diplomatic settlement that held for barely 15 years before the city was lost again in 1244, this time to Khwarezmian forces displaced from further east by the Mongol expansion, a reminder that the Crusader states' fate now depended on currents of power moving far beyond anything happening on the Levantine coast itself. Louis IX of France led 2 further expeditions, the first landing in Egypt in 1249 along nearly the same route as the failed Fifth Crusade, and meeting nearly the same fate, the king himself captured and ransomed at enormous cost. The second, in 1270, diverted to Tunis, where Louis died of disease within weeks of landing, the crusade dissolving before it ever reached the Levant at all. Through all of this, the surviving Crusader territory continued to hold, in steadily shrinking form, along essentially the same principle Richard had established at Jaffa. As long as ports remained in Christian hands, and Italian merchant fleets from Genoa, Pisa, and Venice continued to run supplies, reinforcements, and pilgrims across the Mediterranean on a schedule those cities' own commercial interests guaranteed, independent of any crusading enthusiasm back in Europe, the coastal strip could absorb losses inland almost indefinitely. What changed, decisively, in the final decades of the 13th century was the emergence in Egypt of the Mamluk Sultanate, a military state built by former slave soldiers who proved far more capable than their Ayyubid predecessors at sustained, systematic sieges of the remaining Crusader fortresses. Baybars, the Mamluk Sultan who came to power in 1260, took Caesarea and Arsuf within a single year, 1265, and pressed inland against the fortress network itself. Crac des Chevaliers, the very citadel built to outlast any single defeat through cistern and geometry rather than manpower, fell to Baybars in 1271, after a siege of little more than a month, not because the design had failed, but because the Hospitaller garrison holding it by that date numbered barely 200, far too few even for a fortress engineered to minimize the numbers required, and negotiated surrender under terms of safe passage rather than face an assault the walls alone could no longer guarantee against. One fortress after another followed through the 1280s as the Mamluks methodically reduced what remained of the inland network until the coastal strip itself, the strip Richard had insisted on holding above all else a century earlier, stood as nearly the last Crusader territory left. Acre, the port through which every reinforcement, every supply convoy, every pilgrim ship from Genoa and Venice had passed for 100 years, fell in May of 1291 after a siege lasting barely 6 weeks, its population slaughtered or enslaved, its walls demolished afterwards so thoroughly that the Mamluk Sultan Khalil ordered the site rendered unusable to any future crusading fleet that might attempt to land there again. With Acre gone, the ports that had kept the Crusader states alive for 2 centuries were gone with it, and the remaining coastal outposts, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, fell within the same year almost without resistance, their garrisons evacuating by sea rather than face sieges they now had no chance of surviving. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, which had outlived the loss of Jerusalem itself by a full century precisely because it had kept its grip on the coastline, ceased to exist within months of losing that coastline for good. What the land had determined, across 2 centuries and 10 generations of knights, kings, and popes, was never in serious doubt to anyone who traced its terms carefully. Not piety, not the size of any single army, not the ambition of any Baldwin or Richard or Saladin, but water, distance, and a coastline that either connected a garrison to the ships that fed it or left that garrison to die of thirst on ground it had never learned to read. The Crusader states survived exactly as long as the sea lanes did, and not 1 year longer, a fact the land itself had been stating plainly since the first army crossed a dry Anatolian plateau 200 years before anyone at Acre thought to ask whether the ports could still be held. What happened next along that coast, and to the fortresses left standing empty behind it, is a story the record keeps telling, for anyone willing to keep reading it on the land's own terms.